So, we have been talking a lot about addiction and how it impacts the individual, and there are a lot of things that the individual can do to start to overcome the addiction. You can go to treatment, you can take medication, you can do therapy, you can attend support meetings, which then is, going into a larger society, a larger community that's built in to help you get better, and start to connect with people. And I think, speaking about how one can get better in community, it also makes sense to look at how the community and the system and the family system contribute to addiction. And I guess, conversely, can contribute to resilient factors, prevention, protective factors, and getting better. It was a useful thing to learn in my training that yes, vicarious trauma is a real thing, but so is vicarious healing. It's really interesting when two nervous systems come into contact with each other. Another way to say that is when two people come into contact with each other, they begin to sync up on basically every factor that you measure, heart rate variability, respiratory rate, temperature. They begin to sync up. And an interesting thing is the more well-regulated nervous system has a disproportionate effect on the other, and the less well-regulated nervous system, meaning whoever's more regulated will help to regulate the other one. So that's pretty cool, because I would say that a big portion of being a healer is doing your own work so that you will have the regulation in your being to pass on to other people. So I'm going to give a smattering of viewpoints that look at the family system that aren't necessarily mentioned in the text, to help give a holistic view on how addiction can be started, how it can be worked through, how it can be prevented, resilient factors. All right, so I'm going to start with saying that therapy was initially individual. If you think of Freudian psychodynamic, it's thought that someone has some sort of struggle. They go to the therapist through free association, just talking, whatever comes to mind. They can uncover hidden drives, hidden dormant issues, and begin to work through that. And I think there's some truth to that. I think I see that all the time. I think one beneficial effect of therapy is taking the time to reflect on what's going on with you and processing that verbally, or other ways. There's art therapy, other forms, but processing that and doing it with hopefully a non-judgmental source, you can begin to learn different aspects of yourself. I always get surprised as a client. Stuff will come out of my mouth and I'll have this awareness like, wow, I didn't realize that I was really thinking that, or that I was operating under that. And I don't have to, because it's not necessarily true. So that was kind of initially how therapy started. And then family therapists came around, and it would be, the person who shows up to treatment, the person who shows up to therapy is the one with the issues, the quote unquote identified patient. So we just need to work on those issues and everything will be okay. Well, they said, no, the individual is just representing a breakdown in the family system, and the whole system needs to be worked through. And once that happens, everyone's going to get better. So that is kind of the premise of this book. So this is not necessarily addiction treatment, but it's called It Takes One to Tango. And it's a marriage book. And the idea is that in a system of two, in a marriage, when one person changes, by default, the other one will. So if you're engaging in combat, in, highly conflictual communication, if you disengage from the fight, it's going to change the dynamic, which I think is a nice new way of viewing It Takes Two to Tango. Both of us need to change, and if you're not ready to change, I'm not going to change. No, when someone goes to therapy or when they make it a point to get better, it's going to change the whole system. And that's initially where the idea of codependency came from. So they would find that they would call the non-addicted partner the co-addicted individual or the co-alcoholic. It became, codependent when there were various forms of dependency showing up. So it's not just alcohol anymore, but it's other substances, and it started to be called codependency. And the idea is that, okay, if my loved one is addicted to a substance, I might have codependent tendencies and be addicted to them. And so how they're doing is my addiction. If they're doing well, I'm doing well. If they're not doing well, I'm not doing well. And there's an enmeshment and a lack of differentiation. I am not a separate self from that person. And that can be really challenging to work through. And so often I will recommend to loved ones of individuals with addictions to attend Al-Anon or Alateen or Codependence Anonymous or NAMI, NAMI. It's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they have groups for loved ones who for loved ones of individuals with mental illness and chemical dependency or just mental illness. Because there are often dynamics in play that are keeping the individual stuck, and those same dynamics might show up they will show up as the individual is getting better, going through treatment, to inadvertently often bring them back to a place of stuckness. Because if my role is a caretaker, even if it's not always providing healthy care, I lose my role when that person doesn't need my care, and I might be doing things to put them back in there, which, then could set them up for relapse or staying stuck. It's also the idea of like a dry drunk. So, if you don't go to treatment, you just stop using. Those same dynamics can be in play without the alcohol, and it's not necessarily healthy. It might be healthier, a form of harm reduction, but we're still like caught in this cycle. I use the analogy a lot of a backpack. So say in my backpack are my emotions, my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviors even, and my experience of them. I might, if I am in a codependent place or have codependent tendencies, try to hand them off to you in interactions, and it might provide temporary relief for me. But you end up stuck with them because you don't actually have access to the inside of the backpack. And that is a hard place to be, because now you've walked away, burdened, heavier. I'm feeling lighter, like I said, temporarily because you've taken it on, but then it ends up being frustrating because you can't actually fix it for me. And then when I've done that, I've taken away my agency to fix my own issues as well. And it's a lose-lose, and it's a cycle. That is the work of Pia Mellody. She goes into further detail on that in Facey Codependence, or the intimacy factor. And she identified codependency as a arrested development. So you're stuck in a state of immaturity. And it's interesting because if you buy into the theory, we all regress at various points, and we can regress to various points. So my framework is that there can be positive regressions, negative regressions, and then traumatic regressions. So positive would be, oh, I smelled that thing and it reminded me of this really pleasant memory, and I get to go back there in time for a moment and just really remember that. Usually people aren't complaining about that type of regression, and they're not seeking therapy for that. But negative regressions could be, I had an unpleasant interaction, and something similar got triggered, and I am now in a place where I can say what I wanted to say that I wasn't able to say then. But if I don't link it to the past, it could seem like an overreaction. So my mentor, Noel Larson, Dr. Noel Larson, says if it's hysterical, it's historical. So the idea is if you have a larger reaction than you might expect for the situation, it could be related, it likely is related to something in the past. So if I can link it, I can understand, oh, that's why I'm having such a big reaction, and it's not really about you. And I think the not really about you is nice. It allows for that differentiation. And whoever I'm responding to, if they're taking it on, it is about me, likely it's triggering something from their past, but it's also indicating their lack of differentiation from me. So Pia Mellody goes into further detail about that. Defines codependency as arrested development, says the characteristics of codependency are having a hard time experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. So often people will fall into the one up or one down category rather than I'm okay, you're okay. They have a hard time setting functional boundaries. Often that can be a boundaryless experience or rigid walls or a bouncing back and forth between the two. A hard time owning or expressing your own reality. So knowing what's going on in your body, knowing what your thoughts are, knowing what your feelings are. And you might kind of generally know that, but then if you get in the vicinity of others, it can get really confusing of what's mine and what's theirs and what do I really believe about that. It can lead to a lot of turmoil or indecision. Taking care of your adult wants and needs. So that can show up as not knowing what your wants or needs are, or having a hard time knowing the difference between wants and needs. It can also show up as being overly dependent or kind of needless and wantless. And then finally, the last issue is owning and expressing your reality moderately. So again, that could be having those big reactions all the time, or just not using things moderately, not using alcohol moderately, not using anything that could potentially be addictive moderately, but just taking things to the extreme. So codependence is interesting because it likely starts in the family of origin. And that's how, families can be tied in. If I'm going to step out of my role, maybe my role is the hero, so I'm managing the emotions of my parental figure when I'm young by making everything look good. Or maybe I'm doing the reverse of that by being the scapegoat. So my parents don't really have issues because I'm just displaying all the negative behavior. Those are dynamics, that could lead to codependent behavior. And if I shift out of that role, so I'm not going to be the hero to help you look good, and I'm not going to be the scapegoat to take on your unpleasant experience in any regard. Often those changes to the system might not be well received. And if somebody's not on board on doing their own work, it can be really difficult to engage in new healthy behaviors, especially because new healthy behaviors are often seen as not healthy, as seen as unkind or selfish. I really see that in the Christian community. There's this call to be a servant, and there are verses about, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. And I think that can get really difficult to manage, where how do I set and establish new boundaries and have healthy relationship with you, especially if it feels like it's going against my faith. So for that, I have another resource, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scazzero, and then a daily devotional, Emotionally Healthy Relationships Day by Day. His ministry talks about you can't have spiritual health without emotional health. And so it's really checking into kind of those 5 areas of codependency that Pia Mellody addresses, and learning healthy ways to live with integrity, which is identifying your values, expressing them, and having healthy interactions with others. I would say that goes in line with the work of Gabor Mate, When the Body Says No. So the premise of this book is when we do not set our own boundaries and say no on our behalf, our body will do it for us. So it starts to shut down. It starts to show up as physical illnesses because we are not setting our boundaries. We are not living authentically. That reminds me of The Secret Language of Feelings by Calvin Banyan. So he talks about, this whole book is about figuring out what are my emotions, and we can do that by checking in with the body. And what are they telling me? So what is anger? What is it useful for? Well, anger is useful for, 1, indicating an injustice, or 2, indicating that It's like the biggest feeling that we have when we have a want and it's not getting met, which might not necessarily be unjust. It might just be something that bothers you. So when you can distinguish, okay, is it actually unjust, and do I need to set a boundary or create justice in this? Or is it just that I didn't get what I want and I need to grow myself up and deal with that? It becomes a lot easier to navigate, and it becomes easier to release the emotions rather than just holding on to them and having them show up at different times. That ties into my work as a somatic experiencing practitioner, nearly somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm just a few consultation hours away. Waking the Tiger with Peter Levine is a good book to start on that. So that is the idea that the work of Peter Levine is that there is trauma, and it often represents incomplete survival responses. So if I wasn't able to fight or flight in a situation, either because I was young or because I just couldn't fight or flight in it, like the attacker was actually bigger than me, or I wasn't fast enough or something, I'll go into freeze, and then that survival energy might not get released. And so it stays in there, and that represents a boundary violation, right? So I wasn't able to protect myself. Well, I can have a release. I can experience that self-protective response after the fact. And in that, I'm able to create more boundaries. And in that, I'm able to show up more authentically. So why do I bring all this up? I think I bring up these resources because I feel like this is a lot of the work of therapy and of counseling. It's looking at the underlying drives. I think there are definitely organic brain and body aspects to addiction that need to be addressed, especially in the acute phases of recovery. If your body is not physically well, if your brain is still sick from recovering from the effects of long-term substance use, it's not necessarily a great time to do trauma work and figure out what's underneath the addictive processes. But when they're all taken together, we can look at how was I raised, and what am I believing, and what am I responding to that happened when I was really young that's still showing up. What traumas have I experienced, which, it could be a big T trauma, what we think of as traumatic, going to war, car crashes, that sort of thing. But even little T traumas, things, just a small boundary violation. Somebody comes into my vicinity and I don't feel like I'm able to say no. Look, even doing this, my body's saying it, but if I don't have the experience of being able to say no, that could be a little T trauma that just, builds on itself. So when we take the whole picture and, kind of tying it back to the family therapy in the beginning, often my trauma is connected to the system trauma. So when I start to get better, it's going to disrupt other people, and they might want to bring me back into not getting better, or they might get on board and start to begin to do their own healing as well. So I think it's useful to just take into account the whole picture, which, I didn't even address the whole picture, but to begin to create real and lasting change. One goal of addiction counseling could be to drink moderately. I want to be able to use like a normal user, and that might be possible for some, and that definitely might not be possible for some, but I feel like it's a small goal where, the ability to be present, to be alive, to be engaged, to be connected, to be living out your purpose. I like to hold that in mind. I like to hold in mind, what are you doing when you're in my office? What do you want? What do you want both in my office and with me? But what do you want in this life, out of your life? And I feel like these are keys to begin to open that so that people can live out their full potential with integrity, out of authenticity. And I think, addiction is something that masks pain. And when it becomes to the level of addiction, now we've got two issues. We've got the addiction and the pain. So when we can remove that, we can really begin to do this work. And when we can do that, we can be who God created us to be. All right, that's all I want to say about that. Thank you for listening.